muy слышали хорошо.
Okay, I understand you.
Да, мы слышали очень хорошо.
ABC News presents the joint Apollo Soyuz test project, Union in Space. Brought to you by Western Union, the fastest way to get the word around.
The countdown for history's first Soviet-American space mission is underway. In less than 48 hours, this Tuesday, a Soyuz spacecraft will blast off, followed 7.5 hours later by an Apollo launch from Pad 39B behind me. Never before have two nations launched spacecraft and men to link up and fly together. The mission will prove out future space rescue techniques, but its greatest significance is in the political and diplomatic cooperation it has generated.
This is year 18 of the space age. It all began in October 1957 with the launching of Sputnik, a basketball-sized spacecraft that did little more than beep while sailing around the Earth in orbit. But that was enough. It was the first man-made object that had ever been put into orbit. And it was made in Russia and sent aloft weeks before America's first satellite, Vanguard 1, had been scheduled for launch. Vanguard blew up on its launch pad, humiliating the world's foremost technological power for the second time in weeks. The space race was underway. Americans were stunned again when Yuri Gagarin was launched on this short single-orbit flight just 3 weeks before Alan Shepard was due to be hurled aloft on the first U.S. suborbital mission, lasting just 15 minutes.
Liftoff at 34 minutes after the hour.
All right, liftoff and the clock has started.
Less than 4 months later, Russia launched Germain Titov on a 3-orbit flight. Now 2 Russians had been in orbit, but no American.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
Not until February 1962, 7 months later, would America launch John Glenn on our first orbital mission.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
More orbital flights followed for both nations. There was one major difference. The U.S. had openly declared its goal was the moon, and with Project Gemini, perfected the rendezvous and docking techniques needed. At the same time, the testing of the giant rockets for the lunar mission began, and the 3-man Apollo spacecraft was being built. Russia never announced any flight until it was off the ground, but kept making grandiose generalized predictions and then surprised us. In March 1965, Russia's Alexei Leonov, the Soviet commander of the Soyuz in this week's joint flight, became the world's first spacewalker, emerging from the 2-man Voskhod capsule over the Soviet heartland for a short extravehicular activity. What the Russians never told anyone was that Leonov's spacesuit ballooned so much he was trapped outside the Voskhod until he was able to let out some of the pressure. This was just 10 weeks before Ed White would perform the same feat on the Gemini 4 flight.
The flight director says, get back in.
No, back in. Come on. We still got 3.5 more days to go, buddy. I'm coming.
America finally soared ahead with the Gemini 6 and 7 flights in December 1965, where one spacecraft rendezvoused with another, and a new endurance record was set with Gemini 7 remaining in orbit for 2 weeks. The co-pilot of Gemini 6 was Major Tom Stafford, then flying his first mission. He has since flown 2 other space missions and now commands the Apollo in what we call ASTP, the Apollo Soyuz test project. Both nations pushed ahead, America for the moon, Russia as usual, with mysterious hints but no clearly stated goals. Then both stumbled. 3 weeks before the first Apollo flight, disaster struck. The Apollo 204 fire at Cape Canaveral took took the lives of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, and set back America's space program a year and a half. Russia also experienced its first tragedy in 1967 when Vladimir Komarov died on the first manned flight of the new Soyuz spacecraft. Its attitude control system malfunctioned during re-entry, and Soyuz tumbled out of control. After that, almost all the honors were American as the Apollo program came of age. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders orbited the moon on Christmas of 1968.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
The daring flight had been rushed amidst fears that Russia was about to launch a manned lunar mission. U.S. reconnaissance satellites had pinpointed an enormous Soviet rocket on the launch pad at Tyuratam, a rocket that disappeared in an apparent launch pad explosion. Then on July 20th, 1969, Eagle, the lunar module of Apollo 11, touched down on the moon, and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on man's nearest planetary neighbor.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
5 more U.S. lunar landings followed. Russian spectaculars were conspicuous by their absence.
Приблизилось время старта корабля «Союз-11».
Not until 1971, with the launch of the Salyut space station and Soyuz 11, does Russia begin to move on again. The first attempt to dock with the new space station had failed. The next Soyuz, number 11, succeeds. The goal is long-endurance flight. For 23 days, the 3-man cosmonaut crew works away in the space station, exercising to keep heart muscles toned up for re-entry after their weightlessness. But after leaving Salyut, a hatch seal fails, and all 3 men die when explosive decompression sucks the oxygen out of their lungs. The film we are seeing here was in the film magazines that came back safely on board the ill-fated spacecraft.
Покорение и освоение космоса немыслимо без подвигов.
There is a price we pay for progress, the Soviet narrator tells us in this film. For 2 years, while the Soyuz hatch and seals were redesigned and tested, there were no manned Soviet flights. Now, both nations have learned that there is a price that has to be paid for progress. America goes on to fly not 1, but 3 Skylab space station missions, a space station dwarfing Salyut on flights lasting up to 84 days. But the first phase of the manned space race is ending. An era is ending. Both nations have begun to realize that space exploration is getting more and more costly. Stung by America's landing on the moon, Russia realizes the big prize is not to be hers. When America's first man to circle the moon is invited to Russia for a visit, the stage is set for space cooperation.
Well, before we ever went on the visit, I talked to Secretary Kissinger and also to President Nixon about the possibilities of suggesting this and whether it would be useful in furtherance of their plans, and got the go-ahead. And so we arrived somewhere in late June, or I remember we were there for the 4th of July. In the course of the 10 days that we spent in the Soviet Union, we discussed it off and on with Dr. Keldysh, the head of their Academy of Sciences, and also with several other of their scientists, and also suggested it to the president while we were there.
Why do you think they became interested in flying a joint mission with us after all the competition there had been between both countries?
Well, Jules, I can't really perceive why they want to do it. I would like to think it's because they really have a sincere desire for cooperation in a very, very expensive arena. And I think that the success of our American program probably indicated to them that they ought to cooperate.
Their gee-whiz attitude toward space, not so the Russians. This soaring space needle in Moscow symbolizes Soviet enthusiasm. It is shaped like the ascending arc of a missile lifting off, with a rocket capping it, supported by workers and peasants. Dominating the base of the needle is a heroic statue of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the father of the Soviet space program. A largely self-educated peasant genius, Tsiolkovsky had been ignored by Tsarist Russia. From the turn of the century, he lived and taught in remote Kaluga, 110 miles east of Moscow. In its quest for heroes, Communist Russia discovered Tsiolkovsky, and he was brought to Moscow and honored to take his place as the guiding spirit of the newly created space program. Tsiolkovsky's home has been turned into a shrine, with his books, instruments, tools, and telescopes laid out even as if he was about to use them. A mile away is the Kaluga Museum, a major installation honoring his memory, a full-scale tribute to the Soviet space program. On a hillside terrace are full-size examples of most of Russia's space rockets. The scene is dominated by a Vostok rocket, identical to the booster that hurled Russia's first cosmonauts into space. Inside the museum are duplicate spacecraft and models of just about every vehicle Russia has ever sent into orbit or to the planets. The small lunar soil sampler that was sent up even as our astronauts were first landing on the moon. The one-man Vostok spacecraft in which Gagarin, Titov, and the early Soviet space pilots flew. They ejected from it at 23,000 feet after re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. At the Moscow Space Exhibition, a lunar crawler that traversed the lunar terrain hundreds of yards to get soil samples. The Vashkod, with an improved landing system. It was able to carry 2 men because they no longer had to use ejection seats but could land in the craft. And then Soyuz, the latest Soviet craft, in which Leonov and Kubasov will fly the ASTP mission. There can be no doubt that cosmonauts are the modern Soviet heroes, almost unmatched. And no one is worshipped among the cosmonauts as is Gagarin, first in space and then a tragic death at a young age in a training accident. Statues and busts of Gagarin are everywhere. The Moscow Space Park, the Kaluga Space Museum, Star City where the cosmonauts train. For every Soviet spaceflight, there are countless stamps, pins, and buttons honoring the cosmonauts. Soviet children join space clubs like Americans belong to the Boy Scouts. There's even a Soviet record devoted just to space. This song is called Meeting the Stars.
Я верю, друзья, караваны ракет помчат нас вперед от звезды до звезды. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы. На пыльных тропинках далеких планет останутся наши следы.
Soviet television glorifies the exploits of the cosmonauts, as in this film. (1961), Yuri Gagarin's first and only spaceflight. Attention, attention, 1 minute to launch. I understand. Not identified in the Soviet film is this man, Sergei Korolyov, Russia's legendary chief spacecraft designer, who in the early launches personally commanded the effort after having led the design and testing work on Vostok, Vashkod, and early phases of Soyuz. Korolyov, caught up in the Soviet purges of the mid-30s, did a lot of his work confined in a Moscow prison. After his first jet engine design succeeded, he was given full release, but never given public credit. Not until he died in 1966 was he publicly identified. Now, Korolyov's statues are displayed in all the space exhibits. The Soviet film then shows us most of their early cosmonauts and highlights of their flights. Germain Titov, Pavel Popovich, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman cosmonaut. At the Moscow Space Exhibition, a heroes gallery of all Soviet cosmonauts, past and present, living and dead, a permanent tribute to the more than 36 Russians who have flown in space. 1965, and Alexei Leonov, a 30-year-old cosmonaut, after his first mission, explaining what he had done. Now, of course, he is commanding Soyuz on this week's ASTP mission. This brief walk in space on the Vashkod 2 flight made Leonov a new instant Soviet hero. In reality, Leonov was no new kid in town. He'd been a cosmonaut from the very first days of the late 50s. A parachutist and pilot, Leonov had made 150 jumps. The parachute experience was a qualifying requirement for spaceflight because early space pilots, after ejecting, had to parachute to land. Leonov's wife is a school teacher, a woman of few words in public who is dedicated to what her husband does.
Can your wife give us any idea what it's like being the wife of a cosmonaut?
Безусловно, работа налагает какие-то неудобства, какие-то трудности, но приходится мириться.
It is very difficult for me. My wife said it is everything is need.
The Leonovs have 2 daughters.
Victoria is 13 years old. Oksana is 7 years old.
Leonov's flight engineer, Valery Kubasov, is married to an electrical engineer. They also have 2 children. Leonov is a serious artist.
We're inside the Culture House at Star City, an exhibition of 40 of Alexei Leonov's paintings, many of them dealing with space. This is Vostok 2 in orbit, an earlier Vostok than the one Leonov himself flew. 3 layers of brightness as seen in orbit from Vostok 2 in 1965. A spacewalk painted in 1969, not Leonov's own, which he calls Passage from One Spacecraft to Another.
I started painting when I was a boy, about 8 years. My father made me present in 1942 a lot of color pens and 1 box with watercolor. I drew everywhere and everywhere. I drew on window, on wall. My father very liked it.
A highly sophisticated man, Leonov wears suits he bought in Paris, is a member of the Soviet parliament representing a Moscow district, and in contrast to the cold and stern image many Russians project, has been friendly and outgoing during his visits here.
John, you want some help? Yes, if you could spread some crabs off down at the other end down there.
A police department crab fest in Alexandria, Virginia, with President Ford and Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin.
He does appreciate it.
Mr. Ambassador, where's your vodka?
Next time. I didn't know.
At the Alamo.
What's your name?
At the Astrodome in Houston. A festival in San Marcos. At Cocoa Beach near Cape Canaveral.
Got a dock, Star City, headquarters of the Soviet manned space program. The joint flight has removed a tiny bit of the deep secrecy that has surrounded the Soviet space program for many years. It is the most dramatic and the most visible sign of détente, the relaxing of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union.
25 miles east of Moscow, Star City is a military complex. The Soviet manned space program is tightly run by the Soviet Air Force. Star City looks like a small college campus. Only after America's repeated landings on the moon showed the Russians that they weren't supreme in space did the Soviet High Command begin to open up a bit. The Apollo Soyuz test project is a big step in that direction. But there is still tight discipline and secrecy surrounding the USSR space program. At the same time, the Russians have made big concessions to show off the joint program, a program many think they embarked upon, at least partially, to show the world they had parity with the U.S.
We're in the heart of Star City. They call this area the Gagarin Space Center, named after Yuri Gagarin, the world's first man in space, who tragically died in a jet trainer crash not very far from here in 1968. The cosmonauts live in the buildings right behind us. They train and get ready for flights in the other buildings also on this campus-like setting.
The heart of the training operation at Star City is this simulator building, which houses mock-ups and spacecraft. The biggest thing here is the Salyut space station. Far from being a wooden mock-up, it, like the Soyuz simulators, is an actual spacecraft, which the Russians turn out in what has to be nearly mass production for space hardware.
We're inside the Soyuz spacecraft at Star City. This is the way it'll look after Soyuz and Apollo have rendezvoused and docked and begun to exchange crews for the 2 days of the flight. Tom Stafford, Vance Brand, and Deke Slayton all will take turns here inside the Soyuz spacecraft itself, as well as in the docking module, while the 2 Soviet crewmen take turns inside Apollo. It's the first time any Western newsman has ever been inside a Soviet spacecraft, at Star City or anywhere else.
Soyuz itself is really 2 spacecraft. The descent module, in which the cosmonauts launch and then re-enter and land, and the orbital module, where they live and work during the flight. Neither one is exactly large.
Well, the Soyuz is different from Apollo, but it's certainly perfectly satisfactory. Be no problem.
For a tall man like yourself, is it awfully snug?
Well, snug, but you keep your knees up closer, Jules.
It's adequate in size.
It's adequate in size.
How about the instrumentation and the safeguards as compared to Apollo?
Well, no, they have redundant systems. Like you look over here, they have reserve batteries, and they have the buses split. We've gone over all the systems here, and they use the disciplines in space of having backup systems, interconnects.
Would you buy this spacecraft if you had to launch in it?
Sure, there's no problem. And we've been through all of their systems. They're specialists, and we've analyzed it, and to me, it's a good. I'm going to be flying it in space.
How do you rate Soyuz as opposed to Apollo?
Well, they were designed for 2 different missions. Apollo was designed to go to the moon, you know, and have systems fail out and get back, where this was designed for Earth orbit. If we designed only Earth orbit, Apollo would have been a lot simpler.
Alexei, how do you rate Apollo as compared to Soyuz?
Rate.
Что нравится Apollo?
I know Apollo spacecraft and I know Soyuz spacecraft too. 20 minutes ago I said this is a very different spacecraft. The objective of the Apollo spacecraft is a mission to the moon. The objective of the Soyuz spacecraft is a mission around the ground. Okay. Okay.
Which spacecraft would you rather fly, Alexei, or doesn't it matter?
I like Soyuz spacecraft and I like Apollo spacecraft too. I can fly.
The astronauts' training was the furthest the Russians have ever gone in letting Western newsmen in to look around. The Russians had barely started this facility when ASTP was begun. They then expanded it. Some of the training methods and consoles are startlingly similar to those worked out by the U.S. Space Agency.
Apollo Soyuz, how do you read?
The crew may experience all kinds of technical problems, but the language barrier after 3 years of training isn't likely to be one of them.
Долго стоит. Okay, I understand you.
The American crew will speak only Russian. The Soviet crew will speak only English. We understand each other very well. When Tom speaks in English slowly, I understand too. When I speak Russian slowly, Tom understands me, I'm sure.
I can see you've got the English mastered. But Tom, when you've docked, for example...
Okay.
When you've docked, how are you going to tell Alexei we are opening the hatch?
Сейчас я открываю люк номер 1.
We've equalized the pressure.
Мы выравниваем давление из люк номер 1.
Everything is normal.
Все нормально.
How do you read me, Tom?
Отлично. Как слышите меня?
I read you well too.
No 5 by 5. So I read you well.
Хорошо.
5. 5 by 5. Loud and clear.
Piloting language is really a universal language, is what you two are saying.
Да, это сами.
How about food? Are you both going to try each other's food?
In Apollo spacecraft, we will eat American food. When American member Apollo spacecraft will be in the Soyuz spacecraft, they will eat Russian food. Tom and the other American astronauts tasting Soviet food. The Soviet crew tasting the American food.
How did you take to the Apollo food?
I like it. But I more like Mexican food.
Chili.
Chili.
Завершите обрыв. I'm right here. I just roll like that. Roll position. Yeah, we're already there.
The Soviet training at Star City includes classroom sessions. The U.S. training in Houston included a review of survival equipment for the Russian backup crew.
Signaling mirror.
Signal mirror. Лица, друг, радио. Это радиомаяк.
У нас радиомаяк. Anatoly, как слышите меня?
I read you very well, loud and clear.
Some other signaling devices.
Турбинка.
Да.
Сирена.
Good boy.
Danger.
This is the medical accessory kit. This is this material through here, and this part is here. Most of this is injectable drugs.
В этом находится, значит, большинство находится в этом, да, остальные, значит, особенно уколы находятся в малой упаковке.
For example, let's Call to him.
Yes, we will. I think that's the way we approach it. We pretend now he is sick. We pretend he has gotten sick.
I don't agree.
For documentation, he doesn't want treatment. Okay, first, you'll get his temperature.
How many times does it... Open your mouth. Open your mouth.
Be careful.
Okay, push in and then pull out. This is the other part I want to show you. This is, for instance, a medication for pain, if necessary. You hit it against the surface you wish to inject into.
Очень легко. Не надо очень... Нажми. Просто нажать или... Не, просто приставь.
Не треба тримати.
No. Просто приставь. Толкни, ну да.
Куда? Больше.
Сильнее.
Okay? And this can contain medication for pain, for motion sickness. This type of material is included.
Так оно на такую глубину и проткнет тело. Ну-ка, давай. No, I will cry. Very loud.
Despite the obvious warmth and camaraderie among the crews, there are still some suspicions and closed doors. For 15 years, the Russians have tried to conceal the location of their manned launch port by calling it the Baikonur Cosmodrome. That turns out, as many of us suspected, to be just not true. Baikonur, in fact, is a city 135 miles away from the real launch site at Tyuratam. The Russians weren't even going to let the astronauts themselves look at Tyuratam, their launch center. But Tom Stafford laid down the law, declaring, if we don't see it, we don't fly the mission. And the Russians gave in. Our astronauts were the only Westerners ever to be allowed here, aside from Charles de Gaulle. And the Russians, to preserve the secrecy, flew them in and out and launched into orbit from Tyuratam, Russia's Cape Canaveral.
All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
7.5 hours later, America's Apollo spacecraft will be launched from Pad 39B at Canaveral, the liftoff point for all of America's lunar missions. Then a classic space game of chase will begin, with Apollo in a series of rendezvous maneuvers to catch up with Soyuz, maneuvers that were perfected during our Project Gemini. Soyuz will be the passive target, Apollo the active pursuer, doing the engine burns to catch up with the Soviet vehicle. First, Apollo will maneuver to get on exactly the same planar course, then ever so slowly close in on Soyuz at a speed of less than 1 mile per hour. For the next 30 minutes, the two spacecraft will fly in formation, station keeping it's called, while the control centers and crews of both nations make sure everything is okay. After everybody is satisfied that everything is working, Apollo will inch forward for the actual docking. The world's first joint spaceflight will actually be joined, with the two vehicles linked together. A spacecraft named Soyuz. It's the Soviet word for union or rendezvous, and Apollo.
The mission literally is a union in space. The most unique thing about it is this docking module, which links together the Apollo spacecraft and the Soyuz spacecraft after they're in orbit. To make it happen, both nations had to agree on a common design for the docking module, which was built by the U.S. The docking device or adapter, which links together the Soyuz spacecraft and the docking module in orbit, is an improvement over the previous devices used by both nations. We should see it all happen this Thursday, just after 12 noon Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Moscow time, when the final docking takes place over Germany.
Both Apollo and Soyuz will be sending back live television pictures to Earth via the Applied Technology Satellite, positioned 22,000 miles over the Earth. The pictures will be relayed to the U.S. and Soviet control centers, and from there to the networks and your home screen. For the next 3 hours, the crews will be getting ready to cross over to the other spacecraft. Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov will lower the pressure inside Soyuz from its normal 14.7 pounds per square inch to 10 pounds, to be sure neither crew gets compression sickness or the bends. The American crew will have checked out the docking module, and Tom Stafford, the U.S. commander, will be waiting for Leonov as he opens the hatch on his side and enters from Soyuz. just as they did during this training in Houston. During the 2 days Soyuz and Apollo fly together, each crewman from each spacecraft will switch over to the other nation's vehicle to visit, perform experiments, and eat together. The primary mission objective, as stated in Article 3 of the joint U.S.-Soviet agreement signed in 1972, the testing of joint rescue methods and the new docking adapter. The goal, more simply, is to enable the rescue of stranded spacemen from any nation and to lay the foundation for future joint flights, some already being talked about. When they meet 137 miles over the Earth later this week, it will be the first time the 5 astronauts will have seen each other since their last training session 2.5 months ago. Our astronauts have visited Russia 3 times. The cosmonauts came here 3 times to practice on mock-ups and simulators of the spacecraft and the docking module. The whole world knew Apollo, but Soyuz was largely a mystery. We had a lot of questions about its lack of sophistication, its reliability, and safety after 2 fatal accidents in orbit. These 2 men, Colonel Anatoly Filipchenko and Flight Engineer Nikolai Rukavishnikov, are the backup crew for ASTP. They flew the Soyuz 16 mission this past December for 6 days. It was an exact rehearsal down to the hour of the ASTP flight. The Russians flew Soyuz 16 to reassure U.S. space officials concerned about the safety of Soyuz after its past failures. Here we see how the Soviet methods differ from ours. The rocket and spacecraft are mated and completely checked out inside this engineering building. 4 days before the launch, they are rolled out, still on their railcar transporter, to the pad. They're hoisted vertically to launching position. Filipchenko and Rukavishnikov travel the 1 mile to the pad in a comfortable bus, carrying their portable air coolers, just as U.S. astronauts do. The launch was perfect, and by all accounts, the entire flight was a full success. The 2 cosmonauts had no problem in the orbital part of the flight, and then simulated the docking part of the mission. They carried a mechanical docking ring up with them, and using it, extended and retracted their part of the joint docking system, proving it worked. Just before coming back to Earth, they ejected the docking ring, leaving it in orbit, and here we see Soyuz backing off from the docking collar. A first, the first time we have seen a Russian spacecraft descending on its parachute. With huge open stretches, the Russians have always brought their vehicles down within their own borders on land and have no concern about coming down in a populated area. The U.S., with much less open land, has always used the vastness of the oceans for landing. The dust cloud we're seeing here is apparently snow and dirt kicked up by small rockets the Russians use at the last moment to slow the spacecraft before it touches down. After 2 successes, the next Soyuz failed, and the cosmonauts had to use their escape tower to get away from the rocket as it yawed off course. Some Americans still think the Russians have too high a failure rate. Out of 19 manned Soyuz flights, 5 have failed. 2 crews, totaling 4 men, have been killed, all during re-entry. 2 flights failed to dock in orbit, but the crews got back safely. 1 flight, that first Soyuz 18, was aborted during launching, but the crew got back. Comparing the Russian to the U.S. record, 2 out of 15 Apollo missions have failed. 3 U.S. astronauts died in the ground fire a month before the first Apollo flight. Apollo 13 failed in orbit, but the crew got back safely after flying around the moon. The breakdown, then, is that Apollo has had a 13% failure rate, Soyuz has had a 26% failure rate, exactly double. Captain Gene Cernan, who commanded America's last lunar flight and is special assistant to the U.S. program director, is nevertheless satisfied that Soyuz is now both safe and reliable enough for the ASTP mission.
To me, it's not dangerous. There's nothing unsafe about it, or we wouldn't have come to the agreements, as I said earlier, that we have come to fly in the Soyuz spacecraft. And if you look at it today, Soyuz is a very operational spacecraft. It is going from Earth to space at regular intervals. It's servicing a space lab called Salyut, although not as big as Skylab, it is an effective spacecraft, and in fact, the Russians now have a forerunner to a shuttle vehicle operating today, and very effectively.
What are the basic components inside Soyuz here?
Well, in the orbital module here, primarily behind this big shelf, we have some gauges and some controls, but this is their environmental control system. This is their food for life, if you will, in the orbital module, where they get their oxygen and maintain their pressure and get their water and so forth. Food is stored in many containers like this, and they have them around here, and they have bags, much like we do for weight considerations like this, and they have right up against that bulkhead, a little, what they call a food warmer, where they can put tubular food in there and warm it up, and there's an awful great difference between warm food and cold food in space.
We're inside the docking module, Gene. What happens in here?
The docking module, Jules, is where we go from our low-pressure oxygen to their high-pressure air, and we have to make a pressure change, step up to go into their vehicle and step down to go in our vehicle. So this is, in technical terms, is an airlock, really.
Gene, what happens if things go very wrong and our Apollo spacecraft isn't safe, or their Soyuz spacecraft isn't safe for re-entry?
For re-entry, well, if there's any problems in space, the first thing we've agreed to, and we've practiced this, we've thought about it with the cosmonauts, is that we will immediately retreat to our own.
But are talking about future missions together.
Most familiar with the problem.
The next step for the United States is the unmanned exploration of Mars, the red planet, millions of miles from Earth. America's Mariner 9 spacecraft orbited Mars in 1971 and sent back these tantalizing views. After years of analysis, scientists have concluded that Mars has an atmosphere, albeit terribly thin, and has enough moisture and chemicals so it could perhaps support some form of life. A month from now, 2 Viking spacecraft will be launched on an 11-month journey to Mars, aimed at landing and searching for signs of life and sending back close-up television pictures. Viking is scheduled to land on July 4th of next year, America's bicentennial date. Its mechanical sampling arm will reach out, scoop up soil samples, and they'll be analyzed with the results radioed back to Earth. Following Viking, the next planned U.S. space project is the Space Shuttle, with its first manned flights due in 1979 or 1980. Aimed at lowering the cost of space exploration, the shuttle, with a reusable orbiter spacecraft, will carry scientists into orbit, loft satellites, and bring back broken-down ones for repair. It'll land much like an airliner on a runway at Cape Canaveral. Hundreds of shuttle flights are planned in the 80s to make space economical, NASA says. For the Russians, it'll be more Soyuz and Salyut flights for the time being. But both sides are now talking about other joint flights if ASTP succeeds. On the outskirts of Moscow, this historic and imposing estate. Napoleon spent his last night in Moscow here, and Catherine the Great once lived here. Seldom seen by Westerners, it is the home of the Soviet Academy of Sciences and the focal point for Russian spaceflight planning, where I talked to Dr. Boris Petrov, one of the leaders of the Soviet space program.
You seem to be saying that there are proposals for talking between both nations, and that it's very likely there will be future projects.
Yes, we shall have future projects according our own program, as United States according your national program, and our national program devoted to space research by automatic vehicles and by spaceships or space stations like Salyut. This program will continue, and in the development of this and to realize this national program, it's possible to find several items, several tasks to solve joint cooperation.
NASA's Glyn Lunny, ASTP technical director, confirms that both sides are talking about future missions.
I think where we now go is a discussion of what missions would be productive and useful for both of us to do jointly in the future. We will probably renew those conversations later on this year. In our case, we will be looking forward to operating the shuttle in the 1980s, and there are a whole variety of mission possibilities that opens up. On the Soviet side, they probably, for the near future at least, will continue to operate the Soyuz, the Salyut, and we will probably see advanced versions of those or perhaps entirely new spacecraft by the time the shuttle is operational. And I think the missions of the future will involve those kind of pieces of equipment.
Deke Slayton, the ASTP docking module pilot.
What is happening with their space program that you see?
Well, I can only conclude that they're going on at a very rapid pace. They certainly aren't slowing down, and I would guess they're accelerating, if anything.
And what do you see happening to our space program?
Well, I think we're going to press on, too, but obviously we're kind of at a low part of the curve right now. I'm confident that we're going to get the space shuttle built and operating efficiently, and that space is going to become more of a routine thing. I think part of the problem in this country, we got to stop and go sort of a thing. We hit one thing like the lunar landing, you know, and that's got a lot of charm to it, and so everybody's behind it. But once you've landed on the moon, and you got a whole bunch of people say, well, so you've done that, what else do you want to do? They forget that wasn't really all it was all about.
Missions can go in space. The truly remarkable thing about ASTP is not what it will accomplish, which is minimal, but that it is at all, that it actually is happening. That two nations so politically different, two societies so long suspicious of one another, after 3 decades of confrontation in the Cold War, the Berlin airlift, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the prolonged and continuing conflicts in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, that those two nations can put aside their earthly hostility and distrust to work toward a joint future in space. That's what ASTP is really all about. Can Russia and the U.S. work together toward future flights? No one is sure, but so far the answer seems to be yes, if this flight succeeds. This is Jules Bergman at Cape Canaveral.
Union in Space has been brought to you by Western Union, the fastest way to get the word around.
It's a brand new day on ABC, and we've got a new game show for you to see. To finish a rhyme, it takes a little time, but rewards are great if you don't hesitate. Rhyme and Reason, weekdays at 11. Take a word and stretch it, cut it, bend and blend it, but don't dare say it or that will end it. Join host Tom Kennedy in the new You Don't Say, weekdays at 12, here on ABC.
This has been a presentation of ABC News.